Alright guys, it's time to ruffle some feathers again. So last hinge cutting sucks video that we made, we brought up some points as to why hinge cutting sucks. There was a better alternative in my opinion, and in this video we want to go over an even better option. It's going to put those two options in the back seat. So with that being said, I want to kind of go over the topics of the first video. If you haven't seen it already, I recommend going back and watching that one. But basically what we went over in the last video is we went over the reasons why hinge cutting sucks. There's a lot of downsides to hinge cutting. Now I get it, it's a very popular method on the internet. There's a lot of videos on it. There's a lot of guys saying, hey, go hinge cut your property. In reality, I probably use it with about 5% of my clients. Not very often. There's just too many downsides when it comes to actually getting in there and knowing what type of trees to actually be hinge cutting, or certain locations, doing it strategically so that it's all huntable, and then there's a whole different side of things as far as maintenance goes. And I'm going to get into those just a little bit here, just so we get a little bit of a recap and make sense of why that's maybe not the best option. So hinge cutting, it does create immediate side cover. That is the perk to hinge cutting. The downside is one of the downsides is the safety aspect. If you're not familiar with cutting down trees, you don't know how that tree is going to react off the hinge, you don't know what species of tree you're cutting into, at the end of the day it can be dangerous. And if you're not overly familiar with using a chainsaw, you'd hate for that tree to jump off the hinge or bump into you or do something crazy. If you're working on an ash tree, a lot of people aren't familiar with ash trees. Ash trees drop from the top a lot of times. Widowmaker branches, things like that, and all of a sudden you're cutting into these trees, disturbing the trees, and things are dropping. Why even mess with that safety hazard, especially if you don't have the experience? Another downside is just not knowing how to do them properly. So like I said, it's a secondary option that I sometimes use with very few of my clients, but nonetheless, if we're going to do it, we need to know how to do it right. With that being said, depending on the hillside and the elevation, it's all going to depend. Every situation and scenario is a little bit different. You need to cut that tree to a certain height. For the most part, safe to say that cutting them at about waist height is the best option. From a safety standpoint, you don't want to be cutting at shoulder height, cutting near your head or anything like that. But also, where you make that cut, if done correctly, there should be tons of suckers and sprouts coming up in future years, 2 to 3 years. And basically, if those are at the height of 6 to 10 feet within 2 years, once that sunlight comes through the canopy and actually blows everything up, well, let's face facts. There's no deer at 6 and 10 feet above that cut. So if you already made it high, you kind of screwed yourself over. So making that at waist height, if you are going to do it, is definitely something you should focus on. So the other downside is basically maintenance. So when you make those cuts, where that cut is made, obviously we have the direct side cover right away by dropping that tree, but where that cut was made, you're gonna get those suckers and sprouts up at 6-10 feet. What did you do? You created another canopy. Now you got maintenance, rehinging the hinge. So with all that being said, that was kind of some reasons that we went over in the last video why hinge cutting sucked. And we picked the hack and squirt method. And obviously you have to be selective where you use the hack and squirt method, but going in there and just using something as simple as a hatchet, going on these moderate sized trees to the smaller trees to clear them out, and just applying herbicide, that's all it takes. If you're inexperienced, you don't have to worry about working with a chainsaw. You don't have to worry about the dangers quite as much as if you were hinge cutting, dropping trees for the first time ever. You just don't have to worry about it. And the biggest perk is you can knock out a lot more area in a lot less time. So we can get a lot more work done is what it comes down to. With that being said, guys, those two methods, controversial or not, they take a back seat to method number one that I'm going to talk about. Like I said, I probably recommend those 5 to 10% of the time if this other option isn't available. And in my opinion, this is the best timber stand improvement method that you could possibly use. There's multiple reasons for it. Bring in a logger. Getting select cuts done on your property is probably one of the best things that you can do to not only fund the operation, put money in your pocket, have a constant flow of income, but also create better habitat. And if you do it strategically, do it in certain areas, every couple of years, every 5 years, let's say we do it on a 5-year scale, you're creating new regeneration, you're creating different stages of regrowth, and you're creating edge. And ultimately, whitetails are creatures of the edge. The more edge you have on your property, the more huntable your property is, the more that we can create that pattern. At the end of the day, it's all about having some sort of daylight pattern on your property. If you have the food, and you have the cover, and you have the edge in which they transition in, the puzzle's solved. So bringing in a logger, hopefully getting a select cut done, is definitely one of the best options. Now those secondary options that we just talked about, if there's no interest from loggers, from a financial perspective on your property, that's when we kind of lean towards some of those other options. But other than that, the financial upside that is basically brought in by bringing in a logger and basically just funding the operation over time. It's going to allow you to buy some more of those toys if you want to buy some more trail cameras, if you want to buy some e-bikes, if you want to buy anything. It's going to be a constant flow of income if you do it over the course of a couple years and you're creating the habitat. So if I had to create this hierarchy of hinge cutting, hack and squirt versus logging, guys, I'm always going to pick logging before the hack and squirt and hinge cutting.